All right, guys, hello and welcome back. It is good to have you guys here. Now, we just finished up World War II. All right, we just went from the war in Europe, we shifted to the war of the Pacific, we dropped some nuclear bombs, Germany and Japan surrendered. 80 million people are dead. All right, World War II is the worst conflict in human history. All right, lots of civilians, innocent civilians are dead. That's what total war is all about, guys. Now, you would think that at the end of the conflict, all right, after Nazi Germany surrenders, Imperial Japan surrenders, hundreds of thousands of innocent people are dead, and we are still trying to figure out exactly what the world is going to look like. You would think that everyone would get together and say, we can all agree on one thing, and that is not to go to war again. But that doesn't happen, okay? So immediately after World War I, immediately after World War II, we now undergo a new conflict, one called the Cold War. Why is it Cold War? Called the Cold War? Well, in truth, it's a very, very, very long war. And it starts in 1945 and it goes all the way till 1991. Okay, so I was alive for this war. Now, the reason it's called the Cold War is because it doesn't ever really get hot. Okay, there's certain areas of the world where war is fought, but there's never any huge battles between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And these are the two countries you can see on the slide right here. All right, the Cold War is an ideological conflict between the capitalist West and the communist East. Okay, now in this picture, you see President John F. Kennedy, all right, who was president of the United States between 1960 and 1963, and his counterpart, a Soviet Union Prime Minister or Premier, Nikita Khrushchev. All right, these two are ideological enemies, I guess. One represents the capitalist West and one represents the communist East. All right, which is pretty much all that the Cold War is going to be about. Now, I'm going to give you guys a big synopsis of what exactly happens in the Cold War, okay? And we're going to start by shifting from Unit 7 to Unit 8. So congratulations, guys. We went from Unit 7, which is global conflict, to Unit 8, which is somehow also still global conflict. But this time, the global conflict is going to be the Cold War. Okay. After we're done with the Cold War, we'll shift gears and we'll talk about decolonization. So today we're going to spend a lot of time going through the Cold War. Please ask lots of questions. You should know this is one of my favorite things to teach. And it is, of course, an important lesson. We've been talking about ideology since what? Period 3. Communists, capitalists. We've been talking about Russia. We've been talking about the United States. And today we're going to bring it all together and figure out what this Cold War is all about. So we'll start with a quick meme of the day. Yeah, World War II in a nutshell. So guys, please write this down. In February 1945, all right, so that's 3 months before Germany surrenders in World War II, 3 very, very important leaders are going to meet together. And you guys probably recognize this jerk right here, Joseph Stalin. You might also recognize Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president. And Baldy over here is Winston Churchill. So he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Now, these 3 men get together in Yalta. Okay, it's an island in Europe. And they want to discuss exactly what's going to happen at the end of World War II. How is the world going to look? Now, you might remember, the Soviet Union is communist. These guys are capitalists, all right? They're democratic. And yet all 3 of these guys are allies, all right? The Soviet Union has teamed up with Great Britain and the United States to extinguish Nazi Germany, okay? But when you're dealing with this level of ideological difference, it's really crazy to think about a diehard communist sitting down together and hanging out with these 2 diehard capitalists. But that's exactly what happens. And what they do is they decide what the world is going to look like in the aftermath. They all know Germany's going to surrender. They all know Japan will eventually surrender. Okay. But what does that mean? All right. What is the world going to look like? Are we going to look like communists? Are we going to go back to fascists? Are we going to go, is everyone going to be capitalist, in a capitalist democracy? What is that going to look like? Well, these guys all stick it out and they talk, and you might not be surprised to notice that Joseph Stalin lies through his teeth. All right, he agrees to allow Poland and Germany to have free elections. He agrees to all this stuff. And then at the end of the war, lies and says, just kidding, not going to happen. So you guys might remember from last lesson, I told you that at the end of the war in 1945, the Soviet Union liberated Eastern Europe. The United States, Great Britain, and France to some extent liberates Western Europe, okay? And from the moment, wherever the geography is, wherever you are in Europe, that's what your ideological spectrum is going to be at. So if you're in France, because the United States has liberated you, you're going to be a capitalist. If you're in Poland, which is in Eastern Europe, you're going to be a communist, okay? And as soon as Germany surrenders, all right, as soon as Japan surrenders, the Cold War begins. So what you need to know about the Cold War in the most basic terms is that this long war between 1945 and 1991 is going to be an ideological struggle. All right, it's going to be an ideological struggle between the capitalist West and the communist East. It's going to be an ideological struggle between two new superpowers. All right, so in the aftermath of World War II, the United States is going to come up and be a very, very wealthy and powerful nation. The United States profited from World War II. All right, World War II helped the United States pull itself out of the Great Depression. All right, lots of people were given work. Soldiers, the United States doesn't lose as many soldiers as other places in Europe do. And so after the war, the US is in great shape, okay? The Soviet Union, even though they lost the most amount of people in World War II, communism allows for a quick rebound. All right, the Soviet Union, especially because the Soviet Union has just acquired a bunch of new land in Eastern Europe. So these two superpowers are going to be in great shape in the late 40s, okay? The problem is that because of the nature of these two ideological superpowers, they're going to come into conflict with each other quite quickly. First off, the Soviet Union wants to spread communism. Okay, you want communist partners. You want the entire world to be communist if communism is going to survive. And so Joseph Stalin and the rest of the Soviet Union will actively work to push communism in Eastern Europe, okay, and later in other places. On the other hand, the United States wants to spread capitalism. All right, they want to spread liberation and democracy. And so you can see that these two ideologies, which are in direct opposites of each other, all right, communism and capitalism they don't really work well together because they're the opposites. They're going to come into contact with each other and it's going to be ugly, okay? Now, shockingly, I know this is a shocking thing, the Cold War is going to begin in, you guessed it, Germany. I know, shocking, right? Now, at the Yalta Convention, the great powers decided that at the end of the war, wherever the armies of liberation ended, that was where their troops were going to stay. So the Soviet troops, the end of World War II, had made their way all the way into Eastern Germany, all the way across Berlin. That's Berlin right there. And that's the furthest extent they'd made it, all right? The Americans were in Southern Germany, French, and the British also. So you have these three colors right here are going to be areas of democracy and capitalism. And at the end of the war, this red area is going to be under the Soviet Union's jurisdiction. So Germany is going to be split up into this geographical, like, kind of nightmare almost. There's four little components. And again, you're going to be a communist here because that's the Soviet Union is going to push communism here. You're going to be a capitalist here because that's what the United States, Great Britain, and France will push. Now, 1945 happens, the war is over, Germany is completely destroyed after the Nazis, after World War II. You'd think that, maybe we could give them a break, but we don't do that. The first thing you guys need to know is that Even though Berlin, so Berlin is the capital of Germany right here, even though Berlin clearly falls under the Soviet jurisdiction, because it is the capital of Germany, what they do is they actually split up Berlin as well. So you can see those colors inside of Berlin. You know, you've got French territory, British territory, and American territory, and then Soviet territory. So within this Soviet sphere, Berlin also has these tiny little areas where there is, you know, capitalist leadership. Now, what happens is that in 1948, all right, very important year, the Soviet Union says, you know what? You've got to stop. We want Berlin clearly belongs to us. The United States, France, and Britain should not have these components of Berlin. And so what the Soviet Union does is it completely blocks off all the trains and the canals going into Berlin from the West. Okay. And that is called the Berlin blockade. So the USSR, the Soviet Union, is going to block Berlin for the Allies. Well, here's the problem, guys. When you have an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, the capitalists ain't gonna be okay with this. All right. And on top of that, there were a lot of American and British troops in Berlin, and now all of a sudden they were cut off from the rest of the world. What are we gonna do? All right, what will the United States, how will the United States respond? Well, the first thing I need to tell you is this. In 1948, only one country has a nuclear weapon, and that's the United States. The Soviet Union does not have a nuclear weapon yet. So the United States is like, all right, we're gonna call your bluff. And for the first time in history, the United States and her allies load up a bunch of supplies on airplanes and completely supply the city of West Berlin via air. Now, this doesn't sound like a shocker now, but in 1948, the technology is not really, the planes that are flying from, you know, West Germany to West Berlin, this is a lot of supplies. You're supplying an entire city via air, and it's never been done before. Most of the time, supplies come via train or, you know, the ships. And this, the Soviet Union, they could have responded, but they didn't. All right, they kind of just let it happen. This is such an American thing. You can't tell us what to do. All right, so the West is going to fly in supplies to Berlin, and it's going to refuse to allow the entire city to fall to communism. And so that is the very first time you see the Soviet Union and the United States kind of start to play this game with each other. Okay. Now, later on, the Soviet Union will build the Berlin Wall, and we'll talk about that in the coming days. But just know that the Berlin blockade, followed by the Berlin airlift, is the first sort of battle of this Cold War. Okay? Here's the problem, guys. Oh, I've got a meme for you. Good old Stalin. All right. So during the Cold War, the United States creates a policy when it comes to the Soviet Union. All right. The United States doesn't directly ever really want to go to war with the Soviet Union. All right. The Soviet Union has a huge population of people, and it was a former ally. But the United States does not want the Soviet Union to spread communism. So the US will attempt a policy called containment. And essentially what this idea is that America is not going to stop, it's not going to, so places that are already communist, America won't try to force democracy on it. So the United States isn't going to force the Soviets to be democratic. However, they're going to try to contain communism where it already exists. So the Soviet Union and later parts of Eastern Europe, that's already communist. We're going to write that off, but we're not going to let it spread any further. So what you're going to start to see is any places around the world that start to dabble in communism, the United States is going to go to war with. All right, you're going to see this in the Korean War. You're going to see this in the Vietnam War. Anytime you see some sort of hints of communism trying to infiltrate the governments of these places, the U.S. will get involved. Okay. Now, here's the problem, guys. The Cold War would not have even been a war if the United States was the only country in the world that had access to the A-bomb. But turns out Joseph Stalin also had some scientists that were creating this nuclear weapon. So in the aftermath of World War II, both the Soviet Union and the United States recruit former Nazi scientists to help build these new weapons. Okay. Now we all know that the United States is the first country to actually get the atomic weapon. Right. They get the atomic weapon through the Manhattan Project, and they launch the first A bomb on Japan in 1945. Okay. I told you guys that the name of the bombs, we had Little Boy, which was launched over Hiroshima, and Fat Man, which was launched over Nagasaki. Okay. Well, not too much later, Joseph Stalin and his team of nuclear scientists also create the bomb. And in 1949, all right, just 1 year after the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift, the Soviets now have an A bomb. Okay? And what that means, guys, is that both superpowers are now capable of launching atomic weapons against each other. Well, that doesn't deter them, all right? Instead, both superpowers are going to launch into this campaign of building a bigger and more powerful bomb. So just a few years later, in 1952, the United States creates the first thermonuclear bomb. So you might know it as the hydrogen bomb. And they launch the hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean on a place called Bikini Atoll, okay, in the Marshall Islands. So the reason I have a picture of SpongeBob up there is because this is actually where SpongeBob comes from, all right, the cartoon. So Bikini Bottom is supposed to be sort of that radiation fallout from this nuclear weapon created this weird little Bikini Bottom community. So you guys have probably heard of the Bikini Atoll and this particular bomb, even though you didn't know it. Now, once the United States gets the A-bomb and Russia responds with getting the A-bomb, and then the United States gets the hydrogen bomb, Russia will also follow and get the hydrogen bomb. And so this race for bigger and more powerful bombs also is going to create something called mutually assured destruction. And this is a vocab term. Okay, this is a very important vocabulary term for Unit 8. Okay, what is mutually assured destruction? Well, I will tell you in just a second. I like this slide because this shows you how the bigger bombs are created, okay? So you can see down here, the Hiroshima bomb, which killed 60,000 people instantly in Hiroshima, Japan, is this tiny little weapon. The Bikini Atoll bomb is the Bravo, okay? And the Soviet Union create the world's biggest nuclear weapon called the Tsar Bomb. All right, it's never actually been launched. It's theoretical, but that is how much these bombs keep building bigger and more powerful destructive weapons. So what is mutually assured destruction, guys? Well, you can just call it MAD because in many ways this is a crazy and ridiculous concept. So mutually assured destruction is a strategy. It is a national security policy. Basically, if I have a nuclear weapon and you have a nuclear weapon, and we both know that if we launch these nuclear weapons at each other, it is the end of our society, okay? So if I take my nuke and I blow up you, you're done, you're gone. But you're gonna retaliate before you die by sending your nuclear weapon at me. And at that point, we just destroy both of our societies. So what's the point, all right? If we both have the bombs and we're both afraid of each other using the bombs against each other, chances are good we're never gonna actually use the bombs on each other. Does that make sense? So essentially the idea is that if everybody has nuclear weapons, everybody is too afraid to use nuclear weapons against each other. All right, so if the United States has 50 nuclear bombs and the Soviet Union has 50 nuclear bombs, you ain't gonna use those bombs against each other or your entire society will be dead, killed off, gone. It will be the complete annihilation of both of your societies. What mutually destruction is not is if the United States has a nuclear bomb and, I don't know, Korea does not have a nuclear bomb and the United States drops the bomb on Korea and people die. Well, there's no repercussions for the United States. Okay, so there's not really a mutually assured destruction. It's only when the two superpowers have the weapons capabilities to use against each other will they think it's probably not a good idea to use it against each other? Okay. I like this cartoon. I think this does a good job at showing what mutually assured destruction really is. You're not going to use those powerful bombs against each other. Instead, you're going to use sort of the more antiquated weapons, all right? Or you're going to get other people without nuclear weapons to fight the wars for you. And that's exactly what's going to happen. The United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War never actually go to war with each other. Instead, they get other countries to fight these battles for them. But before I tell you about these proxy wars, I do need you to know the alliance system. Now, I know most of you are like, did we not learn our lessons from World War I? Why the heck are we having alliances now? Alliances during the Cold War are a little bit different. They're ideological. All right. The North Atlantic Treaty, I always forget what NATO stands for. NATO. NATO is an alliance, still exists today. All right, it's the American-led military alliance. So every country in Western Europe that is not communist is part of NATO. So NATO includes West Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Canada, and Turkey. Okay, the goal is containment. Now, NATO still exists today. You guys might have heard it in the news recently. So a few years ago, President Trump talked about potentially leaving NATO. Okay. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, I'm not going to get into the politics. Just know that NATO does still exist, and we are still a leading member of this alliance. You know who's still not a member of this alliance? Russia. Okay, even after Russia loses the Cold War. Whoops, spoiler alert. But on the other hand, after NATO is formed, the Soviet Union is going to form their own alliance, and this one is going to be based on communism. Okay. Also, let's be honest. This alliance has a way cooler badge than NATO does. NATO's is kind of lame. Now, the Soviet-led alliance is, again, it's going to be based on this sort of communist connection. So the Eastern European states that the Soviet Union occupied at the end of World War II are going to be forced to join the Warsaw Pact. Now, the goal ultimately is to spread communism and also protect communism. And so who is in the Warsaw Pact? Well, you probably don't really recognize any of these flags because most of these places don't exist anymore. But East Germany, Poland, and Romania, as well as the Soviet Union, are all part of the Warsaw Pact. Okay? You might have heard the Warsaw Pact referred to as the Iron Curtain. Either way, know these alliances. All right, one is capitalist, one is communist. One is the United States, one is the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, as I said to you guys, at the end of World War II, where the soldiers of the Soviet Union and the United States stood at the end of April 1945 is exactly what the world looked like during the Cold War. What does that mean? Well, guys, the Soviet Union was communist, the United States was capitalist. And so when the United States liberated France and West Germany and Italy, and the Soviet Union liberated Poland, East Germany, and these Balkan areas, these are going to be communist, these will be capitalist. All right, this will also kind of play into the alliances. So everything blue on here is part of NATO, everything red on here is part of the Warsaw Pact. Okay. Now, I know a lot of you guys like to use the phrase, first world problems, but you might not actually know what those terms mean. These terms actually refer to the Cold War. So the first world is considered the capitalist part of the world. The second world is considered the communist part of the world, and the third world refers to everything else, mostly the poor developing nations. So in the context of the Cold War, when we talk about the first world, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about the US, Canada, Great Britain, France, Australia, Spain. When we talk about the second world, we're talking about the Soviet Union, we're talking about China, Kazakhstan, Poland, East Germany, communism, okay? So you might hear me say the first world and the second world, and just know what those terms mean. Now, I said to you guys that mutually assured destruction means that the Soviet Union and the United States are never really going to go to war with each other. Why? Because if the United States and the Soviet Union declare actual true blue world war on each other, it's the end of humanity. All right, both superpowers have the capability of destruction through the ownership of those bombs, those nuclear weapons. So instead, what each superpower realizes is that in order to fight each other, in order to contain communism, in order to spread communism, they're going to have to do it through something called proxy wars. All right, what is a proxy war? Well, essentially, it's a series of wars that the Soviet Union and the United States will fight against each other, but not directly. It will always be indirectly. So both are going to get countries in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America to, they're going to support communist fighters or capitalist fighters to fight each other. Okay. Now, College Board, in their infinite wisdom and all the things they do, wants you to know a couple specific proxy wars. All right, a couple years ago, they asked an SAQ question asking students to identify a proxy war in Asia, a proxy war in Latin America, and a proxy war in Africa. So I'm going to give you an example of all three geographical regions, and I'm going to spend some time explaining them. Okay? So here's some Cold War proxy wars for you. All right, the first one, guys, although I told you that the Cold War launches in Berlin, the first of the proxy wars actually launches in Korea. So the United States will fight a war, NATO will fight a war in Korea between 1950 and 1953. There's not really a winner of this war, and I'll explain what that means in just a second. In 1960, Cuba will undergo a revolution, and the winner of this will be the communist regime. All right, today, Cuba is still sort of communist because of this revolution. All right, between 1962 and 1972, the United States will fight a war in Vietnam. Okay, ultimately, the winner of this war will be communism. All right, the Angolan Civil War will be fought between 1975 and 2005. Ultimately, communism will win. All right, not sounding so good for capitalism, but the USSR will invade Afghanistan in 1979. And for just about 10 years, they will fight a war to try to get Afghanistan to be communism, and they will fail spectacularly. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan will also lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. So what I need you to know about these proxy wars is essentially that the cause of each war is the USSR's desire to spread communism and the American desire to contain it, okay? So let's talk a little bit about each one of these proxy wars. You guys have to know just a few little facts about them because, again, you might get asked a question about it, who knows? One of the most interesting, at least for me, is the Korean War. So in 1950, so remember, this is a year after the Soviet Union acquires a nuclear weapon. In 1950, a newly communist North Korea. So, okay, a leader in North Korea, all right, named Kim, whose last name is Kim, all right, so his grandson is the current leader of North Korea, received the backing from the Soviet Union as well as a new communist country called China. We're going to spend our next class talking about China's communist story because that's a good one. But North Korea essentially, after World War II, Korea is split in half. All right, you have North Korea was given to the Soviet Union and South Korea was given to the capitalist United States. All right, so this is after years of imperial Japanese invasion. So you had capitalism and you have communism, okay? Now in 1950, the communist North Korea decides, you know what, we want to reunify all of Korea under this communist regime. So communist North Korea invades capitalist South Korea. Now, this is the first time those alliances are going to be called up. So the United States calls up its NATO allies, and even though North Korean communists had pretty much made it all the way down to the south of South Korea, the United States comes in, it launches an attack up here, sort of by modern day Seoul, and pushes the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel, the separation between North and South Korea. All right, now I'm giving you a lot of facts here. So NATO is successful, all right? They save South Korea from being overrun, and it is the first time that essentially it tells the Soviet Union, hey, NATO's not going to play. NATO's going to come and protect our capitalist brothers, okay? And here's some details you don't necessarily need to write down, but you should know. The United States and its NATO allies decide, instead of just allowing North Korea to go back to North Korea, what they're going to do is they're going to push North Korea all the way back to the border, okay? And they're going to actually just try to make North Korea capitalist again. But China doesn't like that. China's a newly communist country, so China invades and pushes the United States back. And so in 1953, an armistice is signed. So you guys know what an armistice is. So technically, North and South Korea, it's not really a victory for the communists or the capitalists, but technically North and South Korea are still at war. No surrender has ever actually been signed between the two nations. So yeah, great. But what this means is there's not a stalemate here. Okay, we don't really know who wins, capitalist or communist. Well, neither really. Now the Cuban Revolution is another one. All right, so again, if College Board asks about a Latin American proxy war, here you go. In 1960, a communist leader named Fidel Castro is going to lead a revolution against a leader in Cuba who was backed by the United States government, who we'll just call him Batista. Now, the United States, not that long afterwards, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, decides that he just can't have this communist so close to the United States. I mean, think about it. Only 234 miles from Miami, Florida, is a communist? What? So JFK is going to launch a complete and utter failure called the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion that was going to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. Okay. I am boiling this down to make this quick, guys. Fidel Castro is pissed off that the United States tries to overthrow him. So what he does is in 1963, ignore that. He asks the Soviets to come in and plant a nuclear weapon. Well, the United States, as you can imagine, don't like that. So the United States there's going to be a few moments when the US and the Soviet Union actually might go to full-on World War III. All right, the US tells the Soviets, you cannot plant a nuclear weapon that close. And essentially, after some serious diplomatic maneuvering, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, agrees to not put a nuclear weapon in Cuba, but the United States are also going to be required to move some nuclear weapons out of how close they are to the Soviet Union. So Cuban Revolution, what this means is now we have communism basically on our doorsteps here in the United States. Now, we've got another proxy war fought in Africa, in Angola. All right, this one goes on for years, 30 years to be exact. Basically, what you need to understand is that there's a communist MPLA and a capitalist UNITA. It's going to be fought here. You're going to see Cuba will send communist troops to help the MPLA, and South Africa, which is democratic, will send capitalist troops to fight. So essentially, both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to provide material and money, but the communists eventually win. So over the course of 30 years, 500,000 people are going to die because of this ideological struggle. 1 million are going to be displaced. Okay? Ugly stuff. Now, the Cold War is going to end in 1991, and pretty much the last great sort of battle of the Cold War is fought in Afghanistan. So we know after several years of the United States being at war with Afghanistan that it's probably not a great place to go to war. We probably should have learned our lessons from this right here, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, as you might be able to tell by looking at a map, is very close to the Soviet Union. So in 1979, the USSR will attempt to put a pro-communist leader in power. Okay. Again, the Soviet Union wants to surround itself with communism. The United States, of course, cannot openly declare war and not openly help, but they will support lots of Muslim fighters. So they will provide financial assistance and weapons to a group called the Mujahideen. And so these Muslim fighters are going to fight against the Soviets. And so the Soviets are going to withdraw in 1988, and this is going to cause a serious crisis in the Soviet Union. It will pave the way for the Soviet Union's downfall in 91, but it's also going to pave the way for the Taliban to take control of Afghanistan. So a radical Muslim group that will allow Afghanistan to descend into an absolute nightmare because of this conflict. And the United States, in a lot of ways, supported the group that would eventually become the Taliban. So at the end of this crisis, 2 million lay dead. The Soviet Union lost, and eventually this is going to be the end of the Soviet Union. Okay? So guys, you don't have to write this down, but I do want you to keep this in check. All right, so these are the proxy wars. All right, I didn't really say anything about the Civil War, but I did want to give you guys a list of capitalist and communist back and forth victories. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Chinese Civil War in the next class, how the great Chinese empire, all right, the one that we've been talking about in period 1, 2, 3, and 4, eventually goes communist. All right, the Korean War never really ends, not really a communist or a capitalist victory. Again, Korea is really interesting because the Cold War eventually ends around the world except in Korea. In fact, North Korea is still fighting the Cold War. Okay, North Korea still exists and it is still a communist state. Okay, Vietnam War is eventually going to end in a communist victory, and the Soviet-Afghan War will eventually end in a capitalist victory. You see on this list of proxy wars, never do the United States and the Soviet Union ever direct each other head on. All right, it comes very, very close in Cuba, but it doesn't happen. And it's another reason why we're still here today. Mutually assured destruction. Because the Soviet Union never declared direct war on the United States and the United States never declares direct war on the Soviet Union, we don't have a nuclear holocaust. So that's something to be happy about, I guess. We'll talk about the end of the war and what that means for the rest of the world, but just know that the ideological struggle of the Cold War is something that is defining of the entire 20th century, okay? World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, the global conflicts that define the 20th century. All right, guys, so you know the drill. If you miss class, please send me an email. If not, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you guys soon.